My study of church history actually began probably even before I went to Ambassador College, but certainly at Ambassador College. At Ambassador College in the olden days, we had the Gospels presented the first semester of your freshman year. The second semester, we had the book of Acts, which of course is about church history. And then at the end of the book of Acts, we would cover the story of the church, the development of the church over almost 2,000 years of history. And of course, that was a very quick cursory view. But there are some names that really stood out at that time. The name of the very first Sabbath keeper in America, as far as we know. I mean, obviously there were some Jews in America before then who would have kept the Sabbath, but as far as Christianity, as far as the development of the church is concerned, the very first Sabbath keeper was a man by the name of Stephen Mumford. And everybody concurs that he was the first Sabbath keeper in America. Now, what does that mean? What does that have to do with the history of the church? He also settled in an area called Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island is one of the most interesting places that I've ever visited. In fact, it was a part of my church area when I was a pastor in New England. And as such, I spent many days, many hours in Newport, Rhode Island, wondering where and how someone like Stephen Mumford may have walked the same streets. He lived there. The church met there at one point. How does all of that fit? You know, the study of church history isn't something that's brand new, but it is relatively new. Partly because there was a long period of time in history where all of the material essentially was destroyed. You know, they don't call the period from about 500 AD to 1500 AD the Dark Ages for nothing. A lot of information disappears, especially from the church. Who's interested in keeping the records, and who's interested in preserving information from Sabbath keepers? You see, they were a distinct minority, and the Catholic Church was extremely aggressive during that period of time to protect itself from what they considered to be heresy. So virtually all of the records for 1,000 years disappear. The Inquisition. The Inquisitions were a committee of the Catholic Church in various countries that were given the task of hunting down heretics, killing heretics. In 1 year in Spain, 35,000 people were killed by the Spanish Inquisition. They were hanged. They were boiled in oil. They were burned at the stake. They were put into arenas with wild animals and killed. It wasn't a good time to be a Sabbath keeper or to be anything except a Catholic. And they made that very clear. It was only the Protestant Reformation that actually put an end to the Inquisition. But they also burned all the books, burned all the records. There are virtually no first-hand records from that period of time. Now, there are some, but there are virtually none. All of the information comes from their enemies. How would you like to have your enemy write your story and have it preserved? There were various names used. Some were called Huguenots, some were called Cathari, some were called Albigensians, some were called Waldensians. There were various names. Some of them were names simply applied by their enemies. They called themselves the Church of God. There's no evidence down through history that the Church of God used any other name but Church of God. It's very important. It's very important to us to this very day that the name be the Church of God. The Apostle Paul used it on 12 different occasions. It's found in the New Testament. We have no doubt but it's the true name for the true church. But we have very little historical documentation. So it's only at relatively recent years that we have any serious attempts to record the history of the church. Two individuals by the name of Andrew N. Duggar and Clarence O. Dodd, both leaders of the Church of God Seventh Day, from the Salem, West Virginia branch. 1931, the Church of God Seventh Day split virtually in two. There was a group out of Salem, West Virginia, and a group out of Stanberry, Missouri. They actually got back together and have their headquarters today in Denver, Colorado. In 1949, it was called the Back to 49 movement when the two groups got back together once again. But Andrew N. Duggar and Clarence O. Dodd wrote the first, at least in modern times, history of the church. It was written in 1936. They titled it A History of the True Religion, traced from 33 AD to date. Now, this book is still around. You'll find it in old bookstores possibly. Maybe you could find it online. I don't know. The book received a lot of criticism, or has over the years, and some of it appropriately. You see, Duggar and Dodd basically created certain portions of history. By that I mean they declared individuals to be Sabbath keepers who were never Sabbath keepers in order to make their case. In other words, their intent was to make the case for the Sabbath, and they indeed made their case. Now, their premise was correct as far as I'm concerned. They based it upon following the trail of Sabbath keepers. But because there was little history, they created, in some instances, their own Sabbath keepers. So while the book was exciting, the book was helpful for many in the Church of God, it was inadequate. Later on in 1959, in the Radio Church of God, the first booklet was published on the subject. It was titled The True History of the True Church. It's written by Herman Hay. Herman Hay followed a particular pattern in telling the story of the church. He chose the seven churches of Revelation, or he used the seven churches of Revelation as a continuous development of the church from the New Testament era all the way up to modern times and all the way up till the return of Christ. He followed, of course, the pattern of Sabbath keepers down through the years. And let it be very clear, the Church of God has always been Sabbath keepers, always will be Sabbath keepers, the true church. That does not mean that every Sabbath keeper is a part of the true church. Consider today. You have Protestant churches who are Protestant in every belief, except they happen to keep the Sabbath. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about Sabbath keepers. So the booklet, The True History of the True Church, followed that story from the time of the apostolic era all the way up to today. It was followed up in the 1960s by the Radio Church of God when it published a correspondence course, the Ambassador College Bible Correspondence Course, 58 lessons. 7 of those lessons covered the various eras of the church based upon Revelation 2 and 3. That was the written material by the church over the years. From the 1960s, there wasn't a lot written in the next 30 years on the story. Then in the early 1990s, the Worldwide Church of God began to publish a series of articles on the history of the church, again based on Revelation 2 and 3. It was a series of 10 articles that appeared in the Plain Truth magazine. I actually wrote part 10 of the series entitled The Sabbath Comes to New England, and the story that I picked up and developed from my stay in New England back in the 1980s, leading up in 1987 when we came, of course, to Texas. And then last year, the Church of God, a Worldwide Association, published our first effort at describing a bit of the history of the church. The title of the booklet was Where is the Church That Jesus Built? Chapter 4 is titled God's Church Through the Ages. And it documents in a brief form the story of the church over the last 2,000 years. So except for that effort, very little has been done in more than 30 years on the history of the church. Hence, one of the reasons we chose last fall to have a video or to have a recording of some of the story, a slice of the story that at least we hopefully can preserve. When I read Hebrews chapter 11, I'm always inspired by those who went before the New Testament church. All of those listed in Hebrews 11 preceded the New Testament church. But it always made me think about those who precede the church today, those who've gone before in the last almost 2,000 years. What were they like? Who were they? Why did they do what they did? How difficult was it for them? You know, we live in a period of time when it's not all that difficult, certainly not in our country, to be a Sabbath keeper. That has not always been the case. Many people have lost their lives. In fact, if we were to record all of those who lost their lives because they followed the truth, it would be a very large volume. But here we are today. Have we forgotten our heritage? Do we even know our heritage? You see, today the popular idea is to reject, at least our country seems to be going in that direction, reject its origins, or to try to represent or to represent our origins in a different way than they have been, so that even the origins of our country become questionable, and it's as though it didn't exist. We just sort of came on the scene, the United States of America. There's no real history there. And for some today, the church seems to be that way. It's just sort of here. Well, where did it come from? How did it get here? Some today say, well, there are Christians in every group. Why should there be the church of God? Why should we be that way? After all, isn't it important how you live your life as opposed to what you believe? And if you're only a good person, is that good enough? You simply don't hurt someone, you love people, is that good enough? Of course, we're told, Christ himself said, that by certainly our love for one another will be known. And that's obviously true. But how do you get beyond the fact that the Bible clearly says the Sabbath, God selected it from the beginning, God made it sanctified from the beginning, and he says, it is a sign of my people. Did that end with Israel? Or is it not true today? And as I mentioned already, is the name not significant? Can we just choose any name? You know, we find ourselves at a crossroads historically, and I think it affects the church to some degree, that we have little knowledge, and maybe it's not our fault, of what's gone before. Some of us talk about things that we've seen and experienced in our lifetime in the church. Others say, well, I have no knowledge of that. The various things that have occurred are just simply something someone has told someone about. How do we present the story of the church? How important is that story? I've developed over a number of years a story that I developed personally, or that I was able to put together personally. My story is my story. No one else can tell my story. Much of the material you'll see today doesn't exist anymore. You see, no one is really interested today in preserving the story of Sabbath keepers. It's of little value. Consider the state of Rhode Island today. When we moved to Rhode Island, or we moved to Massachusetts back in 1979, I had to go to Rhode Island State House to get a certificate so I could perform weddings in Rhode Island. See, I lived in Massachusetts, but the church met in Rhode Island, and I was to perform my first wedding. So I went to the State House, the Department or Bureau of Statistics or whatever it was, have to get a little certificate to be able to perform a wedding. And I went, and the lady said, well, can I see your ordination? And I gave her my ordination. This is a true quote. She said, well, is this made up? Is there really such a church? And I said, well, we're really a church. We really do exist. This is my ordination certificate that I'm a minister. Well, where do you live? I said, well, we live up in Massachusetts. She said, well, sorry, you can't do a wedding in Rhode Island, because in Rhode Island, only the Catholic Church can perform weddings. And she said, if you want to perform a wedding in the state of Rhode Island, you have to get the Catholic bishop to come to the wedding, and he has to sign the document. But she said, but you don't have to worry. Slip him $50 and he'll sign it anyway. This is a state official in Rhode Island. So from being an area that was open and was overrun, some would say, by Sabbath keepers, to where it is today, they have no idea. Brown University has no idea that they were founded by Sabbath keepers. It's lost. Harvard has no idea that they were established to develop religious leaders in the New World. But it's all true. My point is how easily things can be lost and how easily we can become distracted in not knowing what our heritage really is. Let's go to the book of Revelation. I believe that to study and understand the story of the church does require an understanding of at least certain aspects of Revelation. Revelation was the most unusual book written by John. I think all would agree. He wrote the Gospel of John, which is different than the previous three Gospels. The Gospel of John basically covers a very short period of time in the life of Jesus Christ, as opposed to the Synoptic Gospels that cover his life. John did not do that. John also wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are written to the church, at least in general. 1 John, he says, "My little children," referring to the church. "We," he says. In 2nd John, he says, "To the elect lady." To 3rd John, he writes to Gaius, but he says, "Born witness of your love before the church." So these are all general letters that were written to the church toward the end of the 1st century. But Revelation is very, very different. Revelation was written to 7 churches. Why these 7 churches? They weren't the only churches in Asia Minor. There were many other churches that existed at the time. Not only, according to historians, at least one historian, there were 18 congregations or 18 churches of God in Asia Minor at the time John wrote. Larger churches like Antioch, Salamis, Tarsus, Edessa, Derbe, Colossae, just to name a few. And then, of course, you had those in Greece, Thessalonica, Corinth, Philippi, all existed. Why these 7 churches? And what is the message to these 7 churches? Notice that the book of Revelation is truly prophetic is what I was looking for. The book of Revelation is truly prophetic, and John doesn't hide that from the very beginning. Revelation 1, verse 1 says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place." The margin in the New King James says, "quickly take place." Wasn't that they were going to happen immediately after that, but when they begin to happen, it'll be very quick. It's not going to cover a long period of time when they actually begin to occur. Then in verse 3, John refers to it this way, "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near." So it's a book about prophecy. Notice verse 4. It says, "John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne." So Revelation is written to the 7 churches. Verse 10, John is transferred or translated. It says in verse 10, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a loud voices of a trumpet." So this isn't a day of the week. This is a period of time so referenced in so many places in Scripture. It's the end time. John is translated to the end time. So this is prophetic. This is prophetic. And then, of course, verse 19, chapter 1. It says, "Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this." So John was asked to record 3 things. What you have seen in vision, things which are, that's the reality of the day, and number 3, the things which will take place after this. And it's all addressed to the 7 churches. Why these 7 churches? That's sort of a dilemma that we faced or that has been faced over many, many years. It is known that the Roman Empire, beginning as early as 14 AD, developed a rather ambitious mail program. They developed 47,000 miles of road throughout Asia Minor and throughout the Roman world. And with these roads came the mail routes. And they had, as we would think of today, sort of like the Pony Express that we read about, they had junctions at major cities where the mail was taken, and from there to another city to another city. Historically, we know that the 7 churches identified by John in Revelation were on a mail route. And the mail route began with Ephesus, which was on the coast. And then it went up to Smyrna, which was also on the coast. And then, of course, it turned inland and made sort of almost a circle or half circle for the mail route. And the mail went in that direction. That's how it was delivered, from Ephesus and so on around to the other cities. And there would have been a way station in each of those cities where the mail would be delivered, picked up more mail, and on it would go between the two cities. It's easily done that a rider could cover 50 miles in a day. It's said that if it was an emergency, within 24 hours, a rider could cover 170 miles, of course, changing horses and even changing riders along the way. So we know that there's something about the mail route. We believe, it is our teaching, that this is prophetic, that it provides a historical panorama of the story of the church from the time of the apostles to the time of Christ's return, just as we see often in Revelation, ending with, of course, the return of Jesus Christ, or leading up to that. So this becomes very important. Of the seven churches, only two escape any criticism: Smyrna and Philadelphia. Smyrna is called the persecuted church. Philadelphia is called the faithful church. The others endure one or more criticisms in this letter. Now, we have to assume that these churches really existed. We believe they did, and that these messages were read by them. But aren't these messages just as important for Thessalonica, for Corinth, and for the other churches? Isn't it a message to the church as a whole? Is the number 7 significant? And of course, is it not for the whole church, as is described in Revelation chapter 1? So we see this as a progressive story of the church from the apostolic time until the return of Jesus Christ. We're not the only ones that see that. A fairly prominent Protestant theologian who wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, John Mumford, wrote this about Revelation 2 and 3. He says, many expositors believe that in addition to the obvious implication of these messages, the 7 churches represent the chronological development of church history viewed spiritually. So it's not an unusual interpretation of this that we see here. So this is the template or the outline. Interestingly, we're going to discover, or we do discover, that among the churches, that 3 of them have end-time references: Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So while an area or a period of time can begin, or a story can begin at a particular time period, it doesn't mean that they cannot overlap and come to an end together. For example, Revelation 3, verse 3, Sardis is told, be careful, I'm going to come upon you as a thief. In time, at least reference. In Revelation 3, verse 11, Philadelphia is warned, behold, I come quickly. In Revelation 3, verse 20, Sardis, we're told, I stand at the door. So it is our belief that these 3 all will coexist at the end time. And I think that only makes sense from even a spiritual perspective, that when you get to the end time, what will you find? Sardis being dead, or we're told dead, those that are dead spiritually, those that are faithful spiritually, and those that are lukewarm spiritually. We will see all of that in the end time. The challenge, of course, for each one of us is that we not be dead spiritually, and that we not be lukewarm spiritually, but that we be the faithful ones that will, of course, greet Jesus Christ when he returns. That's the story. Now, my story has to do with my research and my study that took place a number of years ago. In 1979, we were transferred to Massachusetts. My wife and I, having lived in Georgia at the time and pastoring in Georgia, neither one of us had ever lived north. Well, I guess I shouldn't say it. My family lived in Michigan City, Indiana for a short period of time when I was 2 or 3 years old. But we were Southerners and transferred to Massachusetts, which was a challenge at the time. In fact, and I've told this story before, my little grandmother, who lived in Arkansas, had never really left the state except when she came for our wedding, and we were married in Georgia, and other than that, she was always there. When she was told that we were moving to Massachusetts, she says, "Where on earth is that?" And then she said, "Is that a communist country?" Communism was a big deal back when during her lifetime, and she thought, well, that must be a communist country. And after 8 years there, we determined that our little old grandmother was correct. In fact, George Bush was once asked if you've ever been to a communist country. He said, "No, but I've been to Massachusetts." That's a true statement. So you begin to see a little bit about the state. When we moved to Massachusetts in 1979 on what was a pastoral salary at the time, we qualified for food stamps and we qualified for government housing because there was it was very expensive in that area. We found a home that we were able to buy. These are 1979 numbers, remember, which we thought was pretty steep, for $42,000. And we're able to barely get into the house with help from our families. Our mortgage payment was $249 a month, and we couldn't make the payment. And except for our parents helping us, we survived in Massachusetts. But in the early 1980s, 1982, I received a phone call from Pasadena. And I was asked to do a couple of things. That was during the period of time when Mr. Armstrong was producing the behind the work films, and they were doing the story of the 7 churches. And we were also they wanted to do a TV program about the Sabbath, and asked me if I could do some research for them. Newport, Rhode Island was in my area. Stephen Mumford's name was known, but little else was known about him. You can't find it. Even today, you go looking, you'll find virtually nothing about Stephen Mumford except he was the first Sabbath keeper. So I was asked, well, do you think you could find his home? Maybe it's still there. Do you think you could find where he's buried? Surely he's buried there somewhere. None of these had ever been, I shouldn't say discovered, but none of these had ever been presented before. Only that he was the first Sabbath keeper. That's all you'll read. One sentence about Stephen Mumford in virtually any history that you read. He was the first Sabbath keeper. And that was it. How can we find out more? So thus began a journey and a story that I developed over the next several years. A story that today cannot be reproduced only because places don't exist anymore. You see, Sabbath keepers are not a big priority. I just explained to you in Rhode Island that they have no knowledge of any of this. You have to go searching in old archives to find it, and it's not very well preserved. I was able to do much of that at the time. When I lived in Massachusetts, I did some research about Harvard University and discovered that Harvard was established for religious training in the New World. That was its charter. And in their charter, they have that any minister of the gospel who lives within 40 miles of Boston has free library privileges at Harvard University. It's a true story. You drive out of our driveway in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, where we lived, and there's a sign right on the street as you turn out of our home in the first street where we turn right. It says, Boston, 39 miles. So I went to the library at Harvard, and I said, is this still true? Showed a copy of the charter. She said, yes, it's still true. I said, where do you live? I said, Uxbridge. She says, well, that's within 40 miles. Here's your library card for all of Harvard's libraries, which opened up the theological library, which is one of the largest and the best, really, in the world, certainly in the United States. And it was quite revealing. Brown University provided similar opportunities. And then, of course, there were the Sabbath-keeping traditions in southern Rhode Island that we were able to track down and follow, and meeting some of the old members there. They're still Sabbath keepers, only just a few, but they're still there, and to be able to find it. I'd like to turn to one more scripture before I actually get into the story. I want to preface the story by simply saying, as I said earlier, that the Sabbath is the thread that we follow. The Sabbath is the thread that we follow. But we must be clear that every Sabbath keeper and every person that I refer to here would not necessarily be a part of the true church, of the church of God. But here's our conviction that the true church is going to be among those who follow this path. And of course, it's the path of the Sabbath. But 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19. It says, "Nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands, having the seal, or this seal, the Lord knows those who are his." That while you and I may not be able to definitively say, we follow the thread, that's the story for today, but that the church of God, the true members of that church, were among this thread. But I would not profess to you that all were. The story that I'm about to tell you basically covers a 100-year period of time, from about 1664, when Stephen Mumford arrives in the New World, to 1764, just before the Revolutionary War. That's the story. But how do we get there? Well, let's define a few biblical principles. Matthew 16, verse 18. Jesus Christ gave a prophecy, at least we would certainly call it a prophecy. He said, "I will build my church. I will build my church." But he didn't just say that. He goes on to say, "The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Hades is, of course, the Greek word for the grave. I don't know that there's any doubt that Jesus Christ was saying in this message that the church would never fail. It will not die. He didn't say it would be large. He didn't say it would occupy big territories, but it would never fail. It won't die. And we believe that's true. So the challenge isn't, did the church exist in any era of time, but where is the church in any particular era of time? It requires us to locate the church. And we locate the church how? Well, I've already told you that. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 says it very clearly. This is in three different translations. The King James says this: "There remains therefore a rest to the people of God." Now that's sort of generic, a rest, but it comes from the Greek word sabbatismos. The American Standard Version says this: "There remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God." And then I believe the better translation, the Bible in Basic English, "so that there is still a Sabbath keeping for the people of God." That the people of God will always have been, always will be Sabbath keepers. We can debate, we can discuss the quality of Christian one may be, and that's always debatable. The fact that there may be others who are better Christians than we are does not defeat the idea or the concept that wherever the church is, it must be Sabbath keeping. That is the thread that we follow. So if we're going to pick up the story of Sabbath keepers, where do we start? I want to start during the Middle Ages. In fact, this is a period of time, approximately 1100 AD. This is where we begin to find some historical records. The historical records prior to this are very, very difficult. But we find a group of individuals who were keeping the Sabbath in the area of Lyon, France. They were in the Alpine region of France, and they were highly hunted by the Catholic Church, especially in the 11 and 1200s. The Inquisition was burning brightly, and it was a destruction of the people that were there. They're known by various names. Some know them as Waldensians or Waldensians or Albigensians or Cathari, and various names such as that. Some believe that Peter Waldo was the founder of this group, and he indeed was the founder of a group. Was it the church or was it not? It's very difficult to know because of no records. The only records we have are the records of their enemies. The Catholic Church has a 5-volume work called Heresy Ography. And in that Heresy Ography, they determine or they list the various offenses of these individuals in the Alpine region. They actually sent the armies, the Pope sent his armies in to destroy these people. Some say their name Waldenses or Waldensians comes from the Valdez or Valdense, which was the name of the valleys where they hid out in the Alpine region. It's impossible to know for sure, except the fact they were there. One of the criticisms of the book written by Herman Hay, The True History of the True Church, is that he quotes extensively from the Heresy Ography. The critics said, well, there is no such volume. It doesn't exist. It's one of those things where historians sometimes do, or scholars do, which is not good scholarship. They quote a source, who quotes a source, who quotes a source. And so you keep seeing the same quotes appear over and over again in various writings. No one has the original document, it seems. The original document seems to disappear. Critics said, well, there is no heresiography. It doesn't exist. It was made up by an author hundreds of years ago. During the research in New England, the research in Rhode Island, we actually discovered a copy of the heresiography that was considered long since lost. It actually exists in the library called the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. The oldest public library in America is the Redwood Library. And they actually have the 5-volume work called the Heresiography. We were able to see it and actually confirm the quotes about the Waldenses, the Waldensians, or the Valdensias, or the Valdez. They were Sabbath keepers. You can confirm that. The Catholic Church derided them for observing and being Jewish by observing the seventh-day Sabbath. So we know they were there. There is a group today called the Waldensians that are Sunday keepers. I actually have a letter from the head of the Waldensian Church in America, and he claims that it is not true that they ever kept the Sabbath. They were always Sunday keepers. And I believe that's true for their group. But it's also true and confirmed historically that there were those who kept the Sabbath in this area. They believed in the millennium. They believed in the millennium on the earth. They observed the Passover on the night of the 14th. They washed feet at the Passover. And of course, all this flew in the face of the Catholic Church and brought about their destruction virtually over a period of the next 400 years. Somehow, we don't know how, but it seems that every time the church is threatened, that there's a place where they end up. How they get there, we don't know. No one knows how the Sabbath keepers in the Alpine region end up in England. And of course, the history of England during this period of time is rather interesting as well. This is a quote from the Sabbath Recorder from June the 11th, 1868, and this is a copy of it. The Sabbath Recorder was produced by Sabbath keepers, the Church of God, in the 1800s. It was called at one time the Hope of Israel. It was also later called the Sabbath Recorder. Today, the Church of God Seventh-day calls it the Bible Advocate. But it's a continuation of this same publication. And they record this. In 1552, many in England were known as Sabbatarians. So from southern France, we find them showing up in England. Why England? Well, England went through the 1500s, the debacle with Henry VIII, which Henry VIII, wants to get a divorce. The Pope says no. Henry VIII disfellowships or excommunicates the Pope. The Pope excommunicates him. And so now we have a Protestant church in England. Remember, the Catholic Church is destroying all the heretics in Europe. So now we have Protestantism beginning in England with the Church of England. So England becomes a place to go. How they get there, we don't know, but they show up there in the 1500s. The first booklet written about the Sabbath, the first publication written about the Sabbath, or printed, I should say, was in 1595 by a man named Nicholas Bound. But it was against the Sabbath, which tells us by the end of the 1500s, there were many Sabbath keepers in England. In fact, through the historical records, we know there were 11 congregations that spring up around London by 1600. They call themselves the Church of God. They observe the Passover on the 14th, and they even observe, at least one congregation observes the days of unleavened bread. History confirms that. Not for all, but for this one group. So here they are in England. England seems to be a haven, a good place for the Sabbath keepers to go. But that's going to change. England becomes less allowing of differences of opinion when it comes to the Sabbath day. So let's take a side step and look at a side story. Whenever there is intense persecution in one area, God always provides another place where there'll be at least an element of safety. Where is this other place going to be now? England? Of course, the New World is very attractive at this period of time in the 1600s. A fellow by the name of Roger Williams, born in 1603 in Britain and died in 1683 in New England, is going to become a dominant player in the next chapter of the story. He arrived in Boston in 1630. He was a Puritan minister when he arrives in Boston. And he begins a church in Salem, Massachusetts, which became famous not too long after that for the witch trials. He was a pastor of a Puritan church in Salem. The story is very limited about Roger Williams during this time of his life. The only thing we know is that he was run out of town because he didn't like what he was preaching. So Roger Williams goes to Plymouth, Massachusetts, a few years later, and he begins a Puritan congregation in Plymouth. Same thing occurs. We don't know what he taught, but it was offensive. And basically, he was run out of Plymouth as well because of what he taught. So Roger Williams determines that he will never again be oppressed for his religious views. So he crosses the river between Massachusetts and what is today Rhode Island and begins the first settlement, establishes the first settlement in Providence, Rhode Island in 1636. Now, at that time, there were different types of colonies in America, different types of charters. It wasn't until years later that Roger Williams went to England and obtained a royal charter for the colony of Rhode Island. But the settlement begins in 1636. This is a statue of Roger Williams. This is at Roger Williams College in Rhode Island, which has all of his letters and all of his writings, which is fascinating to read through. Interesting thing here, though, is this statue was put in place in the 1960s. No one knew what Roger Williams looked like. There's no painting of his day and what he looked like. So guess whose face is used for Roger Williams in this famous statue? Ted Williams, the baseball player for the Red Sox, who was the most famous person in New England at the time in the 1960s. So they simply took Ted Williams' face and put it on the statue of Roger Williams. He's Williams, after all. Roger Williams did something, though, that was powerful and profound. We often have the impression that in the New World there was freedom of religion. It wasn't true. The Puritans controlled all of New England, and if you didn't agree with them, then you were in trouble. In fact, they actually imprisoned Baptists and Quakers and hanged them in Massachusetts. The same was true of the other colonies. Roger Williams was determined, because of his experience, that he would not allow that to happen. So in his charter, the actual charter that he obtained years later from the king, says this: "Now know you that we, being willing to encourage the hopeful undertakings, and to secure," I have to read it from up here, I guess, and we have to secure, and to secure them in the free exercise and enjoyment of all the civil and religious rights appertaining to them. This is the important part. This is the first charter in the Western world that guaranteed religious freedom. It wasn't in England, it wasn't in Europe, and only here in the New World. It says, "No person shall hereafter be molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any difference in opinion of matters of religion." We now have a place, because things are going to get very difficult in England in the 1600s. This is Roger Williams Park, sits in northern part of Providence, Rhode Island. It's a state park, and this is a replica of his house. He was a wealthy merchant. He bought the area of where Providence was from the Indians, and he got a charter for the rest of the area from the king. And so this is the the national park for Roger Williams. Roger Williams is famous for something else, though. Remember, he was run out of town for his religious beliefs from Salem to Plymouth and came over and founded Rhode Island. He also wanted to found a church. And he started or began the first Baptist church in America in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, this is the church today. This building was built in the 1800s. But you'll notice on the front of the building it says this, founded by Roger Williams, 1638. The colony began in 1636 in Providence, and in 1638, Roger Williams founded the first Baptist church. By now, Baptist religion was appealing to him, or the Baptist denomination was appealing to him. The Baptists had certain teachings that he wanted to promote. So he begins the Baptist church. The true story is, though, he only lasted here about 6 months, and the Baptists ran him off. And so in Baptist history, they say very little about Roger Williams, except he founded the first church in the New World for Baptists. And that was in Providence, Rhode Island, 1638. But just to show you how Massachusetts was unaccepting of Baptists or Quakers or any other religion besides the Puritans, here's a plaque that is today on Boston Common. Boston Common in the center of Boston is the oldest public park in America. And here's a plaque on the park. It says this, Mary Dyer, Quaker, witness for religious freedom, hanged on Boston Common, 1660. This is what happened if you were a Quaker in Massachusetts. But guess what? Rhode Island is open. And so the Quakers are going to flock to Rhode Island, and the Baptists as well. They now have a place where they can be free and exercise their religion. In Massachusetts, if you were a Baptist, you were subject to being imprisoned. In fact, if you fly into the city of Boston today, the airport in Boston is actually out in the harbor. It's on a little island in the harbor. And to get into the city of Boston, you have to go underground. But as you fly in, there's a little dot of land that you fly over, and you'll see the ruins of buildings on this little dot of land. This is called Noodles Island. It was the infamous prison for Baptists in Massachusetts. It's said, whether it was true or not, but it said that if you were a Baptist and you were arrested, then you were put on Noodles Island and left to starve to death, that they did not feed you, but they locked you up. Whether that's true or not is unknown, but we have many records of individuals going to visit prisoners on Noodles Island who were Baptists. Now let's go back to England. Remember I said that as things get intolerable in one place or intolerable, that there's always another place for freedom. Rhode Island has become that mecca for freedom of religion. But things are getting hot back in England. This is going to cause, and this is the reason you're going to see that Stephen Mumford will leave his congregation of Sabbath keepers in London and come to the New World. This is a pamphlet or a booklet you'll often see of major historical events at this time in England. They were fascinated with printing. By this time that they would actually print booklets to promote an historical event or to document it. It's called a narrative of the Apprehending, Commitment, Arraignment, Condemnation, Execution of John James. This was written in November of 1661, or that's when it happened, November of 1661. Again, keep in mind the dates. John James was a Sabbatarian pastor of the Newcastle church just north of London. One Sabbath day in November, he was preaching, and the King's Guard rushed in, dragged him from the pulpit, took him across the street, tried him and convicted him of treason, and hanged him shortly thereafter. His body was then quartered. He was quartered by tying 4 horses, 1 to each arm and 1 to each leg, and running them in full gallop in 4 different directions. They then decapitated what was left of the corpse and put his head on a pole in front of the church to discourage anyone from coming back to church. Now, his offense was treason. So why was that? Just because he was a Sabbath keeper, why would he be accused of treason? There was a political movement in England in the 1600s called the Fifth Monarchist. And the fifth monarchists were in favor of overthrowing the king and beginning another monarchy. And they patterned it after Daniel 2. Remember, Daniel 2 speaks of 4 world-ruling empires, the statue, and then it speaks of a fifth one, the stone cut out without hands that strikes it on its feet. This political movement adopted this fifth monarchy and claimed that they were to take over from the king and begin what would be a world monarchy that would rule the world, even greater than the British Empire. So with the teaching of the church that the millennium is coming, that Christ is coming and bringing a kingdom to this earth, they were lumped in with the fifth monarchist. And therefore, John James, who preached that, was dragged from the pulpit, hanged, and his body quartered for treason in 1661. Now, what will happen? A panic ensues in all of the Sabbath-keeping churches. Can you imagine that? Hauling your pastor off and killing him. There was a panic now. What would they do? The Sabbath now will come to America. Remember the 1660s. It's going to come to America. And it comes in the person of Stephen Mumford. Stephen Mumford was a wealthy individual and a member of the Church of God Seventh Day in Newcastle, where John James was killed. He may very well have been present on that Sabbath. He has 2 children. His wife is named Anne. His children are named Stephen and Anne, which wasn't uncommon in that day to name your children exactly the same. Not Junior, but exactly the same as your name. So Stephen and Anne Mumford and their 2 children, Stephen and Anne, get on a ship and sail for America in 1664, fleeing from the persecution and looking for a place where they can be at peace. They land in Newport, Rhode Island, 1664. Newport, Rhode Island was an oasis in the New World. Rhode Island itself was an oasis, but Newport was very accepting, at least at the time. So Stephen Mumford arrives in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island is one of the most beautiful cities that I've ever visited. This is a picture of the coastline of Newport, Rhode Island. It's been redone as more of a colonial village. The downtown area, they at least try to keep it as it would have been 300 years ago, and their colonial heritage. But it's such a beautiful area that many wealthy individuals have their summer homes there. Everyone from the Fords to the Rothschilds and so on, and their homes are along what's called Ocean Drive, which is along the coast of Newport, Rhode Island. So while this is what Stephen Mumford would have been met with in 1664, not the homes, but he would have been met with this beautiful scenery. Newport was a village of less than 1,000 people in 1664. The Quakers found it also a good place to go. This is the old Quaker meeting house built in 1699. It's been added on to. You can see the original part is on the end, and they've added on to it since then. But the Quakers were welcome as well. There were also many other things going on in Newport. As I said, it was a very accepting place. There happens to be the oldest tavern in America that's still operating. It's called the White Horse Tavern, opened in 1673, which would become a gathering place for many events during that time. And this is only a couple of blocks from Stephen Mumford's home and from where the church later on was. There's no question that he would have visited here, would have been here, as well as many other famous people during that period of time. The White Horse Tavern, the oldest tavern in America, 1673. Still open for business today. The White Horse Tavern sits at the corner of a street called Farewell Street. Farewell Street takes you to the cemetery, and therefore it's fare thee well on your way to the cemetery, and the street is called Farewell. That's where the White Horse Tavern was. Good place to stop for a drink before you went and buried your Uncle Joe or whoever on your way to the cemetery. This is the Redwood Library, where we found a copy of the Heresy Ography, the statue of George Washington in front of it. George Washington visited Newport many times over that period of time in the colonial time. But here, there's a bit of controversy, though, going on in Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island also claims to be the first Baptist church in America. Roger Williams is given credit for the first, but there's another individual by the name of John Clark who's also given credit for being the first. And there's been no resolution of that. Remember, Rhode Island consists of a mainland where Providence is, and then it consists of islands where Newport is. In fact, it was such an easy geographical division, or natural geographical division, that during the years of the colonial period, they alternated where the governor lived. For one term, the governor would be in Providence. For the next term, the governor would be in Newport. Newport was the center of the islands off Rhode Island, or off the mainland of Rhode Island. So we have a Baptist church in Providence, and we have a Baptist church in Newport, both claiming 1638. The pastor in Newport was a fellow by the name of John Clark. Here's a picture of the old building today. This is not the original building, of course. This was built in probably the 1800s, but it's the location. It's about 2 or 3 blocks from the White Horse Tavern and only a few blocks from where Stephen Mumford would have lived. Stephen Mumford arrives. Stephen Mumford is not a minister, no matter what some may claim. He actually wrote a number of letters back to England asking for advice on spiritual matters. He didn't know what to do. There was no Sabbath-keeping church at the time. He chose to go to the Baptist church on Sunday, keep the Sabbath at home on Saturday. Well, pretty soon, because it's a small community, people began to question him. And he began to tell them about the Sabbath. Before long, there were 11 people keeping the Sabbath in Stephen Mumford's home. 4 of them left and went back to Sunday. Now, the church had a dilemma. The small group had a dilemma. So we have a copy of a letter that Stephen Mumford wrote to Edward Stennett, who was his pastor back in England. He says, what do we do now? You see, they had no issue fellowshipping with people who didn't know the truth. But once you knew the truth and then went back, how could you fellowship? How could you keep the Passover with them? And so Edward Stennett writes back and he says, you cannot fellowship with them anymore. And so the Mumfords withdrew from even attending on Sunday. But there are still others that are attending. In fact, 5 others that are attending who are keeping the Sabbath as well. Until one Sunday morning, Obadiah Holmes, who was the associate pastor for the church, delivered a blistering sermon denouncing anyone who kept the Sabbath as having gone back to Moses. This is all recorded in the church minutes. After Obadiah Holmes finished his message, Samuel Hubbard stood up in the crowd, and he says, Mr. Holmes, are you talking about us? To which Mr. Holmes responded, if the shoe fits, wear it. To which it's recorded in the minutes, a tumult occurred. And everybody was talking and everything was going on. And finally, Obadiah Holmes got them quieted down. And he says, this Thursday they'll be meeting at the church and John Clark will be here to resolve the matter. The 5 of them were requested to show up for a church meeting that Thursday evening, which they did. And they stood there in line in front of Obadiah Holmes, who stood at the lectern. John Clark, who stood at the lectern, Obadiah Holmes to the side. Obadiah Holmes had explained to him what occurred. John Clark said, is this true? Are you keeping the Sabbath on Saturday? No one said a word. He repeated it. Are you keeping the Sabbath or the seventh-day Sabbath? No one said a word. The 3rd time he asked, the smallest, most petite member of the 5, as recorded, stood up, or she was standing, stepped forward. Tacy Hubbard was her name. And she says, yes, sir, Mr. Clark. We must obey God rather than man. To which we're told there was another tumult in the church. At that point, it was impossible for the 5 to go back. They now must do something different. There are now 7 of them who are Sabbath keepers. And they're going to begin the first Sabbath-keeping congregation in America with 7 people. The 7 people are going to be really, if you look at the demography of them, if you look at who they were, there was a single man, there was a man with an unconverted mate, there was a woman with an unconverted husband, and there were 2 couples. Every demographic of the church today was in those first 7 members at the time. Amazing story of these individuals. We'll come to that in a moment, or more of that. One of the things I was asked to do was see if I could locate Stephen Mumford's home. Was it still there? Since he was a wealthy merchant in the city of Newport, Rhode Island. This is an old picture of what's called the Wanton Lyman Hazard House. It's a museum, and it's the oldest home left in Newport. You see, the Revolutionary War destroyed virtually all of the homes in Newport. This home survived. It's called the Wanton Lyman Hazard House because these are the owners, and the builder was a man by the name of Wanton, at least it's thought. I was asked to see if I could find Stephen Mumford's home. I had become acquainted with a lady at the Newport Historical Society by the name of Mrs. Bullhouse. Mrs. Bullhouse knew everything about everything and became a good friend over the years. And I went to her and I said, well, I'm trying to locate Stephen Mumford's home. And I've looked all around, I'm not sure. She said, so I think back in the vault, there's an old file that says Stephen Mumford's will. I said, that might be useful. I said, sure. She said, well, if you have to come with me back into the big vault, and we'll have to, rummage around among all the old papers and see what we can find. And sure enough, we found a folder that said Stephen Mumford's will. Now, it turned out to be Stephen Mumford, the son. But in the will, he said that he had inherited a house from his father, and it was so many rods from the harbor north, and then it was so many rods in a different direction where the house was situated. So I said, well, I'll go walk it off. So I go to the harbor. I walk up the main street in Newport where I was supposed to. I make a turn, and I look up, and I'm standing in front of the Wanton Lyman Hazard House. But it's a museum. So I pay the fee, whatever it was at the time, and go in to look around. And I'm convinced this is his house based upon the will. And as I'm walking around, this wasn't on my first visit, I made several visits, but as I was walking around one time, I ran into a student. He was obviously a student, he was taking notes. And I went over and I talked to him, and he said, I asked him what he was doing. He said he's writing his thesis, he's a student at Brown University, writing his thesis on this house, the oldest house in Newport. And I said, could I give you my theory? And I said, I believe that this home was built by Stephen Mumford. And he said, I do too. I said, I believe that's true. Now, none of the literature had anything to do with Stephen Mumford at the time. The pamphlets you got when you walked into the museum, the information you were given, mentioned Wanton, Lyman, and Hazard, but never mentioned Stephen Mumford. It was unknown. And he says, I've gotten permission to do some soundings and actually some drilling into some of the timbers because they had the house listed as being built in the 1700s. He said, I think it's much older, and I believe, again, Stephen Mumford. It's Stephen Mumford's home. Well, I didn't hear much from him over the next couple of years. Then I found out that he published his thesis, and it was accepted. And now when you go to the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, a museum, they now publish this in the pamphlet that they have. And you'll see it. It says, the oldest surviving house in Newport, the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, was built for Stephen Mumford, 1697. So they changed all of their literature that now reflects that this was Stephen Mumford's home. So this would be the first location for the Sabbath keepers, at least one that's still standing, in America. The house wasn't built till 1697 or approximately, and we're going to find the church begins a little sooner than that. We don't know where they met at that time, maybe wherever Stephen Mumford lived at the time, but this would have been their home. And it's quite a nice home. This is it today, modern picture. Now, I was also asked if I could find Stephen Mumford's grave. Well, I thought, well, maybe he's buried in the backyard. That's true at a lot of places. There's quite a backyard to this, but you can't get back there because it's a museum. You pay to go in the front, you walk around the house, you can't get to the backyard. Well, I was not to be deterred by that. If you see this side street, nobody can see you on the side street. I go back there, there's about a 4-foot wall around it. I'm over the wall, but to my great disappointment, he is not buried there. So I go back to Mrs. Bullhouse. I say, where do you think he might be buried? She said, well, if you go down Farewell Street, There's the old Colonial Cemetery. It's the second oldest cemetery in America. There's a good chance he's buried there. But you say, I don't know where it would be. So I go to this old cemetery, and this is what I see. It literally goes like this in all directions. It's a huge cemetery. Now, during this period of time, I'd gone to a lot of cemeteries. You may not be aware of this, but there's actually a name for those who study cemeteries or study gravestones. The name of it is called taphophile. A taphophile it's from the Greek. It means a lover of graves. And I became an official taphophile. And I, over a period of time, could actually identify a headstone within 10 to 15 years of when it was put there based upon the way they're shaped and based upon how they're done. This is the old Colonial Cemetery that begins in the 1600s and continues on even till more recent date. How would I find his grave? I was convinced he was there, so I walked from the one corner to the other corner all day long, up and down, up and down, up and down. I did this for 3 days. After the third day, I went back to Mrs. Bullhouse. I sat in the chair in her office, and she says, "Why are you so upset?" I said, "Well, I can't find his grave." She says, "Oh, well, you know," she said, "since you left, I seem to remember there's an old plat map of the cemetery. But it's also way back in the vault. We'll have to go back and dig it out." So sure enough, we go back, and sure enough, there's an old vellum plat map, more of a leathery piece of not leather, but not quite paper either. And sure enough, it has every grave and the name on every one. And finally, we found Stephen Mumford's grave here. It was within about 20 feet of the road I used every day to come in. And I would go a different direction, and of course never found it. So with this plat map, I just found Stephen Mumford's grave. This is his grave, his wife next to him, and of course for their 2 children as well. And it's kind of interesting because you'll see that there are some real pagan symbols on his headstone. Of course, it became obvious to me, well, no one puts his own headstone over his grave. So obviously it was put after he dies, and it was put by his family who were never a part of the church, neither his daughter nor his son, which explains some of the pagan symbols. His headstone is broken off in one corner, but it's got a skull with wings at the top, and it's got fruit and other vegetables along the side for his journey into the unknown. And he has food to keep him from getting hungry. Here's what it says. "Here lieth buried ye body of Stephen Mumford, aged 68 years, and departed this life July 1707. Next to him, we find Anne's grave. You can see a little more clearly here. You see the skull with the wings, and you see the fruit and the vegetables on either side to provide food and comfort for the long journey to the New World, wherever that may be. And here's what hers says. "Here lieth buried ye body of Anne Mumford, ye wife of Stephen Mumford, aged 63 years, deceased February 22nd, 1697/8. You mean they didn't even know what year she died in? Here's a closer picture of it. 1697/8. That also told me that this headstone was not put here until the 1720s at the earliest, and maybe the 1730s. See, there's a problem in American history that's been known for a long time, that every date prior to 1752 is suspect in American history. Why is that so? Because the British colonies refused to adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752. Yet it was adopted by the rest of the world back in the 1500s. There's a difference. In the Julian calendar, which was what was being used in the colonial period, and not the colonial period, but during this period, the first day of the year is March 25th, as opposed to the Gregorian January 1. So if she died, which she did in February on the Julian calendar was 1697, but on the Gregorian calendar it was 1698. This also tells me by the shape of the headstone and the dates on the headstone that this wasn't put there till maybe as late as 1740, well after the death of Anne and Stephen Mumford. And another example of that is one of the oldest headstones and well-known headstones in America is the headstone of Roger Baxter, who was one of the original 7 members. He did his own. He was a block maker, so he carved out his own headstone. And here's what it says on his headstone. Here lieth ye body of Roger Baxter, bachelor, block maker, aged 66 years, died 23rd day of April, 1687. He was one of the first beginners of a Church of Christ observing of the seventh-day Sabbath of the Lord in New England. Roger Baxter. Very, very famous headstone because of its history and its shape. I said we found a lot of information at the Newport Historical Society. This is a picture of the Historical Society. And this is, of course, the museum that's in the back of the Historical Society. This is a famous museum, but a lot of people don't even know that it exists. It is the oldest meeting house for Sabbath keepers in America. It was, you see this little house was separate from the museum. It was bricked up, it was wooden, it was bricked up and put attached to the museum and made a separate museum probably 50 to 100 years ago. I'm not sure exactly when. But this was the meeting house built in 1729. So they kept the Sabbath in their home of Stephen Mumford. They then had a building that was destroyed, and then they built this building in 1729, which still exists. Notice that there are no crosses, no steeples, none of those type things appear. The entrance to the building is there. You'll see the little canopy over it. And you look inside, you'll see that the entry door is just to the left there. It would be of the lectern. And they always have, this is typical of their model. They always put the entrance behind the lectern. And it was a very important purpose. So if you came late for services, you were called out by the minister. And it was written up in their minutes that you were late and you had to walk by. So it probably discouraged tardiness. This is the plaque that's there in the museum today of the 7 Sabbath keepers. William Hiscox, Stephen Mumford, Samuel Hubbard, Roger Baxter, Sister Hubbard, Sister Mumford, and Sister Rachel Langworthy. Rachel Langworthy was the daughter of Samuel and Tacy Hubbard. And this is what it says. Beginning of the Sabbatarian Church in Newport, original 7 members listed on the plaque. December 23rd, 1671, old style, that's Julian calendar. But it was, because there are 11 days difference in the 2 calendars, it was January of 1672 by the Gregorian calendar. Again, this period of transition is occurring. One of the greatest finds that we made were the old minutes, and I was quoting from some of the minutes that I read to you that have been preserved. The book in the middle is the oldest book that still exists. Previous book had been destroyed. It's 1692. And the inside of the book, you see the minutes from the various meetings and things that took place in the church. This is the introduction to the book itself of the minutes. And here's a list of the members in 1707. On the right are the actual minutes written in 1707, and on the left is someone's reproduction so you can read them. You'll notice that they listed the men on the left and the women on the right. Or did I say that wrong? So yeah, the women on the left and the men on the right. There are 12 men and there are 30 women who were members in 1707 of the Sabbath-keeping church in Newport. Rachel Langworthy is the only one still alive of the original 7. She's listed here. And then I want you to notice a particular lady listed here her name is Free Love Barker. Who in their right mind would name their daughter Free Love Barker? Well, her mother was Abigail Barker, who had a bit of a quirkiness about her. In fact, there are several letters in the minutes about her. This is a letter of admonition that she received from the church. Notice it says 1729/30 because it was March 15th. If you had a problem with the church, you received a letter of admonition. If you still had a problem, then they came to your home to deal with you. Abigail Barker lived on Martha's Vineyard. It was a ferry ride plus a carriage ride for her to get to church every Sabbath, but she was expected to be there. But she didn't show up every week. So she received a letter of admonition from the church. To Abigail Barker from our church meeting, March 15th, 1729/30. Whereas you were laid under admonition for your evil course of life in keeping bad company and drinking to excess and neglecting to attend God's public worship. So poor Abigail, there are several letters recorded about her, along with others. So one day, she's probably not going to feel really good about all of this still being around. One of the famous Sabbath keepers in New England was a man by the name of Samuel Ward. Samuel Ward was the governor of Rhode Island, of the colony of Rhode Island. He was a colonial governor. He also attended the Continental Congress, and he signed the document of secrecy which preceded the Declaration. This was in November of 1775. Unfortunately, Samuel Ward died of smallpox in Philadelphia before the Declaration was signed, or he would have been a signer of the Declaration. He was a Sabbath keeper, attended the Newport church, but he was never listed as a member. And I've wondered about that over the years, and finally my supposition is that they were opposed to political service. They refused to get involved in politics. They actually refused to register with the government in any way. And Samuel Ward was the governor, and so was his father. Both of them attended the Sabbath church, but neither one was ever baptized. In fact, on their graves, these are their graves in the same old Colonial cemetery. This is Richard Ward, and this is Samuel Ward. They were both Sabbath keepers. On Richard Ward's grave, it says that he was a member of the Sabbatarian church, and then it says his wife was a member for 55 years. Richard Ward was baptized after he left politics and was no longer involved, then he was baptized by the Sabbath keepers. The Sabbath truth spread to western Rhode Island, where at one time in westerly Rhode Island, which is on the Connecticut border, there were over 2,000 members. It was the largest church in America at one point in time. The Sabbath permeated southern Rhode Island. There were names called the Sabbath Path and other names that were related to the Sabbath keepers. Here's a plaque that says 3,000 individuals were baptized in the Pawcatuck River, alongside where the Sabbath keepers met. They were dominant in southern Rhode Island. And until recently, the local newspaper in westerly Rhode Island never published on Saturday. It was owned by a Sabbath-keeping family until about 20 years ago it was sold. But the Westerly Sun was never published on Saturday. The Sabbath keepers were dominant in this part of Rhode Island. Those in Connecticut would come to services and cross what's called Boom Bridge. This is Boom Bridge today, but it's not used today. It's closed off. But at the time of the Sabbath keepers, if you came from Connecticut to Rhode Island, because you couldn't meet in Connecticut on the Sabbath, you had to cross the Pawcatuck River. And you either walked several miles upstream to the nearest bridge, or you used what was called Boom Bridge, where they cut a tree down, put it on the trunk, and swung people across the river. And it's noted in the church minutes that so-and-so showed up dripping wet because they fell off Boom Bridge. But they didn't fail to come to church. This is where the original building for Sabbath keepers was built in America. 1680, it was on this location. It burned down shortly thereafter, and some of the members remained there and set up a tent and kept services there. But it's in another cemetery where it was. This is the gate of Brown University, founded by Sabbath keepers back in the early 1700s. They have no knowledge of that today. You have to do a lot of research to discover that. The first president of Brown University was James Manning, who was a member of the Sabbatarian Church. Many of the old documents were discovered in the John Hay Library and also in the Rockefeller Library, which is also located on Brown University. Rockefeller Library has a basement where they have all their archives. And I was allowed to have access to their archives, to very old books. But when you go down in the basement, you had to turn a switch and the lights would stay on until the clock ran down, and you had to go run and turn it back on again. We were looking for a particular book called Samuel Hubbard's Journal. We were told by every source we could find that it no longer exists. One time I was standing in a stack of books and the lights went off, and a person with me went to turn the lights on, and I had my hand on a book and I pulled it out of the shelf. It was Samuel Hubbard's Journal. And that provided tremendous information. They recorded when they first began keeping the Sabbath and all of the things that went along with it. Samuel and Tacey Hubbard. It was quite a find. I have photocopies of it today. This is the state capitol in Rhode Island. It's the only state capitol made completely out of marble. It's made out of Georgia marble. But on top of the capitol, they have this statue. No one knows exactly what it is. Is it a Roman? Is it a Greek? No one knows, but it's called the Free Man. That Rhode Island stands for freedom of religion, and that's where the church was able to go. From there, of course, the church spread to western Rhode Island, from there to New Jersey, from there to Iowa, and from there to the West Coast. where in the 1930s Herbert Armstrong came into contact with the Church of God, Seventh Day. This is an interesting sign. I don't know if you can read it very clearly. This is a suburb of Piscataway, New Jersey. It's called Quibbletown. It says a colonial hamlet which was so named because of dissension as to whether Saturday or Sunday is the Sabbath, and they called it Quibbletown. It's a suburb of Piscataway, New Jersey today, but no one really knows what the true history really is. Let's go back to where we started, and we'll finish this very quickly. Matthew 16, verse 18. This is the prophecy Christ gave to the apostles. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall never prevail against it. The challenge isn't, does the church exist at any period of time? The challenge is, where does the church exist? I hope the journey today has been interesting. I hope it provides you at least a brief glimpse at a portion of our heritage and where we came from. I remind you again of 2 Timothy 2, verse 19, that God knows his. He knows them. And God knows the ones who were truly a part of the true church and those who may not have been. But we're convinced, I'm convicted, that the true church of God came to America through these people, and from there spread across the country to where we are today. One of the challenges facing our country today, and also the church today, is that we not forget our heritage, where we came from, and that we not lose our focus. Consider our country, rewriting history to seemingly deny our origins. In a similar way, there's been an attempt to categorize the church as nothing more than another denomination and rewriting the history of the church itself. And yet, the truth is that the church is identified as a spiritual temple, stones built together for that particular temple, identifying the people of God. There's a very important lesson given to the churches of God in the book of Revelation. That lesson can be summarized in this way. It's a warning through the ages. Keep your focus. There's a job to do. Reject heresy and obey God. It isn't complicated. That is the story of the Church of God. It is the message to the seven churches. I enjoy telling the story. I hope you enjoyed hearing the story. It is a part of our heritage from the past. It tells us a bit about ourselves today.